Well, I surely don't need to elaborate on what a great honor it is for a Baptist layman such as myself to share this conference and this pulpit with so many great Baptist preachers and pastors, evangelists, and also to preach to so many Baptist preachers from around the world. If it didn't raise problems with my eschatology, I might be inclined to think that the millennium had come. It certainly is a joy and a privilege to look into this auditorium, to stand in this place where the Prince of Preachers once stood, to speak on this subject, which we do believe is very vital in these days. Speaking of eschatology, I suppose that there are differences of eschatology among us. I think, though, that one thing on which we would agree is that as far as the last days are concerned, we're far closer to the last days than anybody's ever been before. Our salvation is nearer than when we believed, and these are urgent times, these are critical days, and we are in a battle for the minds of men, especially the minds of young people today. I might, before getting into the message, take just a moment to explain something about the work that we're doing at San Diego. Some may be interested in knowing more about it, and we'd like to keep in touch with you if you'd like to know more about our work. We just started it 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, the Christian Heritage College and the Institute for Creation Research. As far as the Institute is concerned, we have a threefold program of research and writing and teaching in the field of creationism, scientific creationism. We are trying, as the program suggests, to reestablish a valid scientific apologetic for the Christian faith in our secular world, especially in our schools. We do have literature, books, and so forth, as well as a monthly news magazine that you're welcome to receive free if you like. If you would like to receive any of this, why, I would just suggest that you write to me. I think if you just put the name Henry Morris, Institute for Creation Research, San Diego, it will eventually get there, and we'd be glad to hear from you. Now, this is a great gathering, a great convocation. There was another great convocation in 1959 on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the publication of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. This convocation was held in the University of Chicago, 1959, and to that meeting, probably the greatest gathering of evolutionary leaders, the leaders of evolutionary thought from all over the world, came that had ever been gathered in one location. They spent a week paying homage to Charles Darwin, giving papers, discussions, thousands of people in the audience. And the keynote speaker for that convocation was the man who is probably the world's #1 evolutionist, if there is such a person, Sir Julian Huxley from England. And in his keynote address, Sir Julian said this. He said, "The first point to make about Darwin's theory is that it is no longer a theory but a fact. No serious scientist would deny the fact that evolution has occurred, just as he wouldn't deny the fact that the earth goes around the sun." And of course, this is the point of view which is held in the schools here in England. It's held in the schools in the States. I spent 6 weeks in New Zealand this summer, universally taught there. And around the world, this is the point of view which is taught our young people. Evolution is a proved fact of science. No serious scientist questions it. And unfortunately, many Christians, of course, have been intimidated by this pressure and have felt that they must compromise. After all, men have said, it really doesn't make much difference about this. This is a peripheral matter. It doesn't affect the vital essentials of our Christian faith. What difference does it make where we came from? What's important is where we're going and how we're getting there, what we're doing now. That's what's important. This is just a peripheral matter, so let's don't get involved with this. Let the biologists worry about it. It's a biological theory. But quoting again from Sir Julian, here's what he has to say about that. He says, "The concept of evolution was soon extended into other than biological fields. Inorganic subjects such as the life history of stars and the formation of the chemical elements on the one hand, and on the other hand, subjects like linguistics, social anthropology, and comparative law and religion are now studied from an evolutionary angle. Until today," he says, "we're able to see evolution as a universal and all-pervading process." And then he goes on to define it. Sometimes people say, well, it only means change, that's all. And of course, everyone knows that things change, so don't get excited about evolutionary change. But it means a certain kind of change, and here's his definition. He says, evolution, in the extended sense, can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge, indeed, he says, forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, one single process of self-transformation. So, evolution becomes exceeding broad. The whole of reality is evolution. And note that he is speaking not of an evolutionary process controlled by some kind of an external creative agent, some God out there, but rather he says it's a process of self-transformation. The universe, by means of its own properties and processes, is transforming itself into higher and higher levels of organization and complexity. Well, now many Christians, as I say, faint-hearted at this sort of evolutionary pressure from the scientific establishment, have said, well, we can't fight science after all. Science is knowledge. We can't argue with science, so therefore we'll simply have to adapt our theology to this. We'll have to reinterpret Scripture in some way. We'll have to find some means of accepting the long ages of evolutionary geology and fitting them into Genesis in some fashion. And we'll have to reinterpret creation to be creation by evolution and so on. And then we might say, well, now, if we do that, wouldn't that be all right, Sir Julian? We don't have to be atheistic evolutionists, do we? Can't we be theistic evolutionists? And I'm quoting again from his keynote address. He said, oh no. He said, Darwinism removed the whole idea of God as the creator of organisms from the sphere of rational discussion. Can't even talk about God. Be considered sane in this brave new world of the future, you see. Then he goes on, he says, Darwin pointed out that no supernatural designer was needed. Since natural selection could account for any known form of life, there's no room for a supernatural agency in its evolution. He says, we can dismiss entirely all idea of a supernatural overriding mind being responsible for the evolutionary process. Well, these are great swelling words, but there are certain words that can be said in response. He says that no scientist questions this. Well, there are some who do. Right in the very year in which he spoke these words, Dr. W.R. Thompson was selected to write the introduction to the centennial edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, which was published in commemoration of that great anniversary. Dr. Thompson is one of the leading biologists of the world. At that time, he was director of the Commonwealth Institute of Biological Control in Ottawa, Canada. And when they asked him to write the foreword for the book, he said, well, all right, I'll do that, but understand I'm not going to join all the other scientists in praising Darwin's theory because I have some other things to say about it. And they said, oh, that's all right, go ahead and write the book, or the foreword. And so some of the things he said are most striking. In fact, his entire introduction is a thoroughgoing scientific critique of the theory of evolution. And for one thing, he says, for example, that the success of Darwinism was accompanied by a decline in scientific integrity. And then here's sort of a summary towards the end of his introduction. He says the general tendency to eliminate by means of unverifiable speculations the limits of the categories nature has presented to us is the inheritance of biology from the Origin of Species. To establish the continuity required by the theory, historical arguments are invoked even when historical evidence is lacking. Thus are engendered those fragile towers of hypotheses based on hypotheses where fact and fiction intermingle in an inextricable confusion. Just last year, a new edition of The Origin of Species was published here in London, and it was felt that perhaps Dr. Thompson's foreword wasn't what ought to be associated with the book. So they asked another man to write this foreword. This is Dr. L. Harrison Matthews, Fellow of the Royal Society. And in his introduction, now he's an evolutionist, I understand that, but at the same time, note what he says. He's discussing Professor Thompson's foreword in his new foreword to the new edition of Origin of Species. He says, much of Professor Thompson's criticism of Darwin's text is unanswerable. In accepting evolution as a fact, how many biologists have paused to reflect that science is built upon theories that have been proved by experiment to be true? And how many remember that the theory of evolution has never been proved? The fact of evolution, he says, is the backbone of biology. Biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? And note what he says in conclusion of that point. He says, belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. That's an interesting admission from a leader of evolutionary thought. Now, we would recognize this, of course, that as far as science is concerned, creation cannot be proved any more than evolution can be proved, because science, by the very nature of science, the definition of science and the scientific method, science is knowledge, that which we know to be true. And the scientific method has as its essential experimental observation, repetition. And we can't repeat the origin of life or the origin of man. We can't bring these things into the laboratory to study. There's no way we can compel the Creator to create in our laboratory to see how creation works. It isn't accessible to the scientific method. And the evolutionist often criticizes the creationist on this count. He says, you expect us to accept creation as a scientific alternative to evolution, but you can't demonstrate creation. It's not a scientific process that you can show us in the laboratory. And that's quite true. But of course the same thing specifically and exactly is true with respect to evolution. Nobody has ever seen evolution working in the scientific laboratory. It's outside the domain of observational, experimental science. Both of them have to be accepted finally on faith. One makes a choice, and it isn't a scientific choice because it can't be tested scientifically. Now, you see, to be precise in our use of terms, we ought not to use the term fact when we speak of evolution. Dr. Huxley says evolution is a scientific fact which no serious scientist questions. It can't be a fact because it can't be proved. And if it were a scientific fact, of course all scientists would accept it. But do you know that today there are literally thousands of scientists around the world who reject evolution? You haven't been told this in the schools, I know, but nevertheless it's true. In the Creation Research Society, for example, which was only founded 10 years ago, there in the States we have approximately, not quite, but approximately 500 scientists who are members. And in order to be members, they have to have postgraduate degrees in some field of science, and also sign a statement to the effect that they believe in the account of creation in Genesis as literal historical truth, also accepting the worldwide flood of Genesis. And the purpose of the society is to study in the different fields of science and to rethink and restructure science in the framework of creationism. And we publish a quarterly journal of scientific articles in this field. And these men represent every field of science. We have many Ph.D. biologists in the society who are creationists, and many Ph.D. chemists and physicists, and all the other sciences are represented. So you see, we can say that a man can be well trained and qualified, experienced in any field of science, and to understand all of the facts of his science within the framework of special creation. You don't have to be a scientist, or you don't have to be an evolutionist to be a scientist. Now, it isn't a scientific fact. Really, it shouldn't even be considered a scientific theory, because a theory is something that ought to be capable of being tested. That's what a scientific theory is. You see, ideally, we ought to be able to set up some kind of a laboratory experiment. We would set the apparatus up in the laboratory and run the test and make the measurements, and then on the basis of the results of those tests, we would be able to decide whether evolution or creation were true. But there's no way you can do that. There's no experiment that you can conceive of, let alone operate, to give you that information. Creation isn't taking place. It can't be seen in the laboratory. If evolution is taking place, it operates so slowly that it takes millions of years, and we don't have millions of years to watch an experiment. There's no way that we can demonstrate which of the two is true scientifically. So it isn't a scientific theory or hypothesis. The proper term, of course, to use is scientific model. That's a perfectly good scientific term. A model is simply a framework or a system of thought within which we try to understand the facts of the world as we see them. And so we define the two models of origins, the creation model and the evolution model. And then we try to see which of these models fits the facts of biology and geology and the other sciences and the real world in which we live more directly and easily with the smallest number of problems, and that model would probably be the best, although we recognize we can't ultimately prove either one of them scientifically. Now, when you do that, we're convinced that the creation model always fits the facts much better, more simply, more directly than does the evolution model. with a much smaller number of problems and secondary assumptions that have to be brought in to explain the problems. Now, what are the models? Well, the two models are simply this. We've already defined the evolution model in the words of Sir Julian Huxley. It's a directional process occurring in time, giving rise to higher levels of complexity, continuing, going on, the whole of reality and so on. In other words, evolution is a system or a model which attempts to explain the origin of life and man and the world and all things in terms of processes which are continuing right now. That's the evolution model. The creation model, on the other hand, says you can never do that. You'll never explain the real world as it really is, as we really see it operating that way. In order to explain the real world, we have to postulate a period of special creation in the past, in which processes were being used by an external, transcendent creator, processes of creating and making things which are no longer being used. It was a completed period in the past. It isn't going on today at all. And furthermore, another special period of destruction, a period of special construction processes and destructive processes, rather than continuing uniform processes. We have to postulate this as a minimum in order to explain the world as it really is. This is the creation model. And as I say, when we take these two models and we use them to study the facts of the real world, we find the creation model always fits those facts better than does the evolution model. And therefore, we believe it's a better scientific model. Now, the evolutionist says, well, creation is a religious theory. You have to believe by faith in creation. Therefore, don't bring that in the schools. If we're talking about the schools and the television and the newspapers and the organs of society, these have to be secular, and therefore we have to teach evolution here. Creation is religion. If you want to teach that in your church, it's okay, but in schools, teach evolution. That's science. Creation is religion. Well, we want to point out that creation, if we approach it on this intelligent, logical, scientific manner, will always fit the facts, the scientific facts, much better than evolution. That's what we want to discuss tonight. Now, I want to do it this way in the time that we have, and there isn't going to be enough time to do this, but just to sort of give you an idea of some of the approaches that we can use, we want to show, just very briefly, that there is no scientific evidence that evolution is occurring today. There is no scientific evidence that evolution has ever occurred in the past. Furthermore, there is no scientific evidence that evolution could occur at all. And then finally, even if it could occur, there's no evidence that there's been time enough for it to occur. Now we want to do this strictly on a scientific basis. What about the processes of the present? Is it really true that the processes that we see operating today in biology and chemistry and so forth, that these are processes of evolution, as Sir Julian says? Well, if they are, then there must be some evidence in these present natural processes that things tend to develop from simpler forms to higher forms. After all, that's what evolution has accomplished, if it's really true. The evolutionary model, as it's normally presented in the schools, is something like this, that the universe in some raw, primeval, chaotic form is infinitely old. Matter is eternal in some form. But then maybe 20 billion years or so ago, matter began to evolve into elements, and then into stars and galaxies and so on. And about 5 billion years ago, the Earth evolved. And first, for a long time, there were only inorganic compounds and systems on the Earth, but about 3 billion years ago, some of the chemicals in the primeval soup began to acquire the ability to reproduce themselves, and life began. And then the various complex forms of life began to develop from simpler forms of life. Beginning about 1 billion years ago, we have multicellular marine invertebrate life in the Cambrian period. And then the marine invertebrates gradually give rise to the vertebrates. And then the fishes give rise to the amphibians, and about 100 million years or 200 million years ago, some of the amphibians became reptiles, and the great age of the dinosaurs began. And they died out about 100 million years ago, or a little less. And some of these primitive reptiles gave rise to birds, and others to mammals. And then finally, some of these mammals gave rise to man, and man finally evolved about 3 million years ago. That's the usual picture of the evolutionary systems. Well, the result of it then has been a tremendous rise in complexity from primeval chaotic particles up to the complex structure of man's brain with its 10 billion cells and the cerebral cortex and so on, the most complex aggregation of matter in the universe. From particles to people, that's a tremendous rise in complexity, and therefore, if this is really what evolution has done, we ought to be able to see some kind of a process operating today where simple kinds give rise to higher kinds. But when we look at the real world, nobody ever sees anything like that. We see a lot of change, of course. Certainly it doesn't take 1,000,000 years to produce a large number of varieties of dogs or of cats, but you never see a dog turning into a cat or a horse into an elephant. The kinds, there are many varieties within the kinds, but no kind ever is transmuted into another kind, so far as anybody's ever seen. Well, I've read about some things like that. Every once in a while I read things like, I've read about frogs turning into princes, for example, and but you don't read things like that in books of science. In other words, to make evolution work, we have to have some kind of a magic wand. There's got to be a magician present to make a low kind turn into a higher kind as far as anything we've ever seen in the real world is concerned. And remember, science is what we see. Science is what we can see operating, observation. That's the essence of science. Oh, I know we see changes. And of course, the classic example of an evolutionary change, this is cited in all of the evolutionary textbooks, all the textbooks of biology and so on, cite this example. The standard example of the peppered moth here in England. Originally sort of light-colored, and then with the Industrial Revolution, the atmosphere got dark and the tree trunks got dark, and the predators picked out the dark moths, and so it began to turn into the light moth began to turn into a dark moth. And finally, the light-colored moth was dominantly a dark-colored moth. And that's the number one evidence of evolution. Well, of course, that happened. That's a good evidence of natural selection, all right. But it isn't evolution. The moth is still a moth, still a peppered moth. It isn't beginning to be a butterfly or a dragonfly or something. It's still the same kind of animal. Let me quote again from Dr. Matthews' Origin. He's talking about this very example. He says, the peppered moth experiments beautifully demonstrate natural selection, or survival of the fittest, in action, but they don't show evolution in progress, for however the populations may alter in their content of light, intermediate, or dark forms, all the moths remain from beginning to end Biston betullaria, which is the species of the peppered moth. So it hasn't changed at all. In other words, this principle of natural selection is simply a prediction of the creation model, because you see, when the Creator created a moth and all the other kinds, He created within each kind the ability to vary quite widely on a horizontal level within the kind, so that when the environment changed, instead of the species becoming extinct because it didn't fit the new environment, why, it could adapt to the environment. All this was created within the genetic potential of the species. And this is a tremendous testimony to the forethought of the Creator, not to the power of evolution. And that's the only kind of change we ever see in the real world, that kind of horizontal change, variation within a kind. So that doesn't prove evolution. In other words, there's no evidence that evolution occurs today. These small variations fit the creation model much better than they do the evolution model. But what about in the past? Now, you see, one of the key facets in the evolutionary model must be the origin of life. And we would expect, if we didn't really know any better, if we were just coming from outer space somewhere and we didn't know what we were going to find on the earth, we would expect, if we were evolutionists, that since life had evolved from non-life in the past, and the same processes are still operating, therefore we would see it happening today. But nobody sees this happening today. Nobody has ever seen non-living things evolve into living things in the present world. And so what does the evolutionary model have to do? Well, it brings in a secondary assumption. It says, well, conditions were different in the past. And in the past, conditions were such that life could evolve from non-life. There was a reducing atmosphere and a different sort of a hydrosphere and different sorts of electrical discharges. And so a different ocean and a different atmosphere and different processes evolved into different organisms which don't live anymore. And this is what happened in the past. Well, maybe nobody can go back and see what really happened. Scientifically you can't. But there's no evidence of that. And as a matter of fact, if we look a little more critically at the possibilities, some interesting calculations can be made on this. What would you say is the simplest form of a living substance? Well, probably a protein molecule, the simplest kind of a protein molecule which can reproduce itself. We might say that's the simplest form of life. A simple replicating protein molecule. It doesn't seem like it would take so much to evolve a simple replicating protein molecule until we look more closely at the tremendous complexity in such a system. Now, one of our modern sciences is what we call information science, information theory, in which we try to study the amount of structure or content, call it information, in any kind of a system. And one of the leading scientists in this field is a man by the name of Dr. Marcel Golay, and in one of his articles in Analytical Chemistry, he was dealing with this question and comparing it with the complexity of designing a computer which could replicate itself and make other computers. Now, you read science fiction stories, I guess, about the coming computer age when we'll get such complicated computers that they can make other computers that'll make other computers and they'll take over, have a computer world. Well, and this is something that people are thinking about anyway, and so Dr. Golay examined this possibility, and he said, suppose we wanted to build a machine capable of reaching into bins for all of its parts and capable of assembling from these parts a second machine just like itself. What's the minimum amount of structure or information that has to be built into the first machine? The answer comes out to be of the order of 1,500 bits. That is, 1,500 choices between alternatives which the machine has to be able to decide. Now, you get the picture. Here we have a machine which is so complex that has a whole array of bins out here, and it has to take a choice between two of them to reach in and get the right bolt or something and fasten on, then make another correct choice, and so on, 1,500 times in succession without a mistake. If you could design a machine which could do that, you would have a machine which could make another machine which could make another machine, and so on. Well, it doesn't seem like it's impossible. 1,500 is not such a big number until we realize what the probability is. Now, the probability of one correct choice, you see, is 1 out of 2 because he has to make a correct choice between alternatives, or it has to. And then the next one is 1 out of 2, so the chance that that the machine's going to get the correct choice twice in succession is 1/2 times 1/2. And then the next one is another factor of 1/2, and so on. So we multiply 1/2 by 1/2 1,500 times, and we get then the probability of success is 1/2 to the 1,500th power, or one chance out of a number represented by 2 to the 1,500th power. Now, if you want to work this out a little bit with logarithms, you can get this, that 2 to the 1,500th power is equal to 10 raised to the 450th power. And now you can visualize this by writing it down. You can write down 1, then with 450 zeros. That number, 1 with 450 zeros, that's the amount of order that has to be designed into that machine in order to make it able to reproduce another machine. Now then, he goes on and says, this answer is very suggestive because 1,500 bits happens to be also of the order of magnitude of the simplest large protein molecule, which immersed in a bath of nutrients can induce the assembly of those nutrients into another large protein molecule just like itself and then separate itself from it. It's the same problem, you see, as having a protein molecule back in that primeval soup which is so complex that it can reproduce another protein molecule, the same amount of structure, 10 to the 450th power. Now, that's an awfully unlikely possibility. That you see, there was nobody back there to guide that protein molecule, no scientist to put the parts together in the laboratory. Of course, scientists can't do that even today with all the equipment and apparatus they have and so on. But there was nobody there to guide it. It simply had to do it by chance. This bath of nutrients in the primeval soup somehow just had to come together in such a way, randomly, to get such a complex structure that it has this much information in it, able to reproduce itself. Now, that doesn't faze the evolutionist. He brings in another assumption. Let me quote now from Dr. George Wald, who is professor at Harvard, one of the greatest scientists in this field in the world, I suppose. He says, the important point is that since the origin of life belongs in the category of at least once phenomena, time is on its side. However improbable we regard this event, given enough time it will almost certainly happen at least once. Time is in fact the hero of the plot. The time with which we have to deal is of the order of 2 billion years. What we regard as impossible on the basis of human experience is meaningless here. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One only has to wait, and time performs miracles. There's the magic wand. You see, time. If we just have enough time, anything can happen. That's the key. Thomas Huxley used to say years ago in Darwin's day that if you put monkeys at a battery of typewriters and let them peck away on those typewriter keys long enough, eventually they would peck out the works of Shakespeare. Anything can happen if you wait long enough. And of course, time is the answer to a lot of things according to the evolutionary model. But now, is there really enough time? Let's look at that a little more critically. Two billion years is a long, long time, all right. But now, how many of these trials can be made in 2 billion years? Let's work at that. Now, how big is the universe? Let's say that the universe is 5 billion light years in radius. That's about what the telescopes seem to show, about 5 billion light years. Light travels 186,000 miles a second, goes a light year in a year, so it's a big, big universe. And that's the biggest thing we know. Then let's take the smallest thing we know about, which would say be the electron. It takes about, they say, about 2.5 million billion electrons to make a line an inch long. So now let's jam the whole universe, solid packet everywhere, with electrons out to 5 billion light years. Now, how many electrons would the universe hold? It turns out that the entire universe would only hold 10 to the 130th power electrons. Now, if we say that we assume that each one of these electrons is one of these systems of protein molecules trying to organize itself to where it can reproduce itself, we certainly couldn't have any more systems trying to do this in the whole universe than that. Even if life evolved somewhere in outer space and was transported to this planet by astronauts or something, even if we had that, life way out there somewhere, we still couldn't have more than 10 to the 130th power sets of systems trying to get to this point. But now let's say that each one of them can try, and then when it fails, let it try again, and then when it fails, let it try again, and keep on trying for, well, let's not only go 2 billion years, let's go 10 billion years. That's the age of the solar system, maybe. 10 billion years. If you multiply by the number of seconds in a year, there are 10 to the 18th power seconds in a year. And then let's say that each system can make 1 billion trials every second, and it certainly couldn't be any more than that. So it seems that the maximum number of trials we could get in all time in all the universe, the maximum conceivable number of trials that could ever be made to do this by a random process, would be 10 to the 130th power, that's the number of systems, times 10 to the 18th, that's the number of trials per second, times 10 to the 18th is the number of seconds in 10 billion years. And you add all this up, you get 10 to the 150th times 10 to the 18th times 10 to the 18th, which is 10 to the 166th power. 10 to the 166th power, that's the total number of trials that you can make. But in order to be sure you get one that's going to work, you have to make 10 to the 450th power trials, because that's the amount of structure that's in that system. Now, it might happen. You've got a chance that it could happen. Of one chance out of 10 to the 450th divided by 10 to the 166th, or one chance out of 10 to the 284th power that this could happen anywhere in all the universe and all time, even at these tremendous rates of trial and error. Well, it might happen, but nobody's going to bet too much on it, I don't think. And yet, this is the simplest type of protein molecule. This is a long way from a living cell, or from a living animal, or from a living man. And you see, there's no evidence that this could have happened no matter how old the universe is. What about the fossil record? This is a concept, of course, that is presented to us as the main evidence for evolution. Dr. Dunbar, in his standard textbook on historical geology, says, although the comparative study of living plants and animals may give convincing circumstantial evidence, fossils provide the only historical documentary evidence that life has evolved from simpler to more and more complex forms. Now, we don't want to go into the technical details of this. We don't have time, but this is the main evidence for evolution, the fossil record, the record of different forms of life that once lived on the earth in earlier ages. The idea is that as you go back into, say, the Cambrian period, you find only simple marine invertebrates about 500 to 700 million years ago. And then you come to more recent times, you find more complex forms of life. And so here we have, even though we don't see evolution occurring before our eyes today, supposedly we see the evidence that it has occurred in the past in terms of the fossil record in the sedimentary rocks of the crust of the earth. And this sounds pretty impressive until we look more closely at what this fossil record really consists of. Now, I don't have the time to discuss this adequately, and there's so many questions I know that this raises. But let me just point out that even when we look at these fossils, and even if we accept the geological age system as it's presented to us, there really is still no evidence that one set of fossils has ever evolved into another set of fossils. Fossils don't tell us anything about evolution. They tell us about extinction. Fossils are dead things. They give us the record of how they died, not how they evolved. Now, the interesting thing is that as you look at this fossil record, if evolution is really true, we ought to find a tremendous array of transitional, intermediate, incipient forms in the fossil record. Even though we don't find, for example, anything between a dog and a cat in the present world, we ought to find some evidence of a common ancestor and a transition in the fossil world. But what we find in the fossil record is some extinct varieties of dogs and some extinct varieties of cats, but we don't find anything between a dog and a cat in the fossils any more than in the present world, nor do we find any common ancestor of the dog and the cat with the transitional forms going up to the dog and the cat in the fossil world, or any other transitional forms in the fossils. Now, some evolutionists might argue with that. They say they're transitional forms, but really the transitional forms that are cited in the fossil record are transitions within the kinds. There's a transition from one kind of trilobite to another kind of a trilobite, or one kind of an ammonite to another kind of an ammonite, but never a transition from an ammonite to a trilobite. There are always variations within the kind, just as there are in the present world, but never from one kind into another kind. Now, there are some examples. For example, Archaeopteryx is the most common example that's usually put in the books. Archaeopteryx is the animal that was supposed to be halfway between a bird and a reptile. Archaeopteryx, been several fossils of Archaeopteryx found, and it does show that, for example, Archaeopteryx had some characteristics of birds. It had feathers, had wings, so on. Also had teeth and claws like a reptile, so it's supposed to be proof that reptiles evolved into birds. And Archaeopteryx is the missing link between reptiles and birds. But as a matter of fact, all really serious paleontologists recognize that Archaeopteryx was a bird. It wasn't half bird and half reptile. It's a bird. And the reason for that is that because, well, what is a bird? A bird's an animal that has feathers, has warm blood. Reptile has scales, has cold blood. Archaeopteryx had feathers, had warm blood. Archaeopteryx was a bird. That's all. Now, you might say, well, how come he had teeth? Modern birds don't have teeth. Yeah, but that doesn't really prove anything, because not all reptiles have teeth either. Some of them do, some of them don't. And the same thing applies right on. Some amphibians have teeth and some don't have teeth. And some mammals have teeth and some don't have teeth. Some people have teeth, some Well, at least I'm glad to see you're still listening. So why couldn't some birds have teeth? Archaeopteryx is simply an extinct bird that had teeth, that's all. And anyway, even at the most, there's no transition between the reptile ancestor of Archaeopteryx and Archaeopteryx, and there must have been literally billions of animals in between the reptile and Archaeopteryx. Literally billions of them, because a tremendous change must have taken place. The scales had to turn into feathers, and the legs had to turn into wings. And somewhere along the way in the fossil record, we ought to be able to find some kind of an animal that has halfway scales and halfway feathers somewhere, or halfway legs and halfway wings somewhere, but nobody ever finds anything like that. And this is true right across the board. Every kind of basic structure or organ or system in any kind of animal, the first time it appears, is already fully developed. Now, so that you won't have to just take my word for this, let me read from Dr. Neville George, Professor of Geology at the University of Glasgow, in an article called Fossils in Evolutionary Perspective. He's talking about, in Darwin's day, the prediction of Darwin and other evolutionists was that additional fossil collecting would reveal all these transitional forms which they didn't have in Darwin's day, and would prove evolution. But now, of course, 100 years later, we still don't have any. Dr. George says there's no need to apologize any longer for the poverty of the fossil record. In fact, in some ways, it has become almost unmanageably rich, and its discovery is outpacing its integration. But nevertheless, he says, the fossil record continues to be composed mainly of gaps. Mainly of gaps. The links are still missing. Now, we don't have time to discuss what the true interpretation of these fossils is. I'm convinced that it's in terms of the Great Flood, primarily, but we'll have to save that for another time. There's no evidence that evolution took place in the past any more than it's taking place in the present. And now we begin to see that there's evidence that it couldn't take place at all, because do you know that there's a basic law in nature a basic law called the law of entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics. Let me quote from Dr. Harold Blum. He's describing this law. Dr. Blum is an evolutionist, very convinced evolutionist, but he says this law, this second law of thermodynamics, has as one of its consequences that all real processes go irreversibly. Any given process in this universe is accompanied by a change in magnitude of a quantity called the entropy. All real processes go with an increase of entropy. The entropy measures the randomness or the lack of orderliness of the system. The greater the randomness, the greater the entropy. Now, I read that pretty fast, but what he was saying was that every process, every system that we know about in the real world of observation, if you leave it to itself, it'll go down towards disorder, disorganization, towards a state of probability, towards unavailability of the energy. Every system tends to go that way. In other words, there is a universal process of change in the world. Dr. Julian Huxley says that there's a universal process which says that everything goes towards higher levels of organization and complexity. But the second law of thermodynamics says there's a universal process which requires that all systems tend to go towards lower levels of organization and complexity. If they change on a vertical level, of course there is a horizontal level of change, conservation, but if they change vertically from one level of complexity to another, systems don't go up, they go down. That's the second law of thermodynamics. The theory of evolution is not even a theory, it's a model. Can't be tested, can't be studied, it's simply a belief. The second law of thermodynamics is a law of science, if there is such a thing, because it has been tested and has been proved true over and over again on every kind of a system that is capable of being studied. In the real world, and always, there's a tendency to go towards lower levels of complexity. That's the second law of thermodynamics. The first law is the law of conservation. Now, when we ask the evolutionists about these problems with his evolutionary theory, we ask him, for example, how come we don't see evidence of transitional forms in the fossils? And the usual explanation is something like this. And here's another one of these secondary assumptions, which may be true, but we can't really test them. He says, well, when evolution took place, it took place in small populations. There were periods when there was a greater amount of radiation, and therefore greater amounts of mutation took place, and a small population evolving rapidly, and consequently the intermediate forms didn't have a chance to become fossils, and that's why you don't find any transitional forms in the fossils. Maybe so. Nobody can go back and see. That's a secondary assumption. And you see, here's the difference between the two models. The evolutionist tries to explain the problems with a secondary assumption. The creationist doesn't have to do that because he predicts the gaps. His model predicts what he finds in the fossils. The evolutionist has to explain what he finds in the fossils. That is, these gaps between the kinds. Now, it may be that that's what happened. Nobody can really go back and see. But it does seem like what they're saying is that the reason we don't find any evidence of evolution in the present world, you see, is because evolution goes too slow. It takes millions of years. And the reason we don't find any evidence of evolution in the fossil world is because evolution goes too fast. It occurs explosively. At any rate, we don't see it anywhere. And science is supposed to be what we see. And what we see is exactly what the creation model predicts. Gaps between the kinds in the present world and in the fossil world. That's what we would expect on the basis of the creation model. Its predictions come true exactly. And the evolutionist has to explain and explain and explain why he doesn't find what his model predicts. Maybe it's true, but at any rate, it isn't what we'd expect. Now, when we ask him how come this second law applies, he says, well, but you have to remember that the second law applies only to closed, isolated systems. And the Earth is not a closed system. It's an open system. It's open to the energy of the sun. And there's enough energy from the sun that bathes the Earth to keep evolution going for a long time, even though maybe eventually the sun will burn out and evolution will stop. But for a while it can be supported because we have the sun's energy. And he feels that that is a sufficient explanation for the problem between evolutionary theory and the second law. But that's no answer. It ought to be obvious that that's no answer because this statement applies to any system of any kind. In other words, every system is an open system. The idea of a closed system that's an ideal concept which doesn't exist in the real world. Every system is open, and every system is open to the energy of the sun. And therefore, to say that doesn't say anything. That applies to any system. There has to be more than that. Every system is open to the energy of the sun. If that's all it took to produce growth, you see, all you have to do to build a building would be to pile the bricks out on the construction site, leave it open for the energy of the sun. It's an open system, the sun's energy. Let the sun make it go up into a building. Why not? That's what the argument says. All you have to have is an open system and available energy, and there's a great deal more energy than necessary to build a building on that site. And furthermore, a building isn't nearly as complex as the simplest protein molecule. If the sun's energy could do one, it could sure do the other. But of course, that isn't what's going to happen. As time goes on, instead of those bricks coming together to make a building, they're going to disintegrate back into the dust and make dust. That's what's going to happen. And that's what would happen in that protein molecule, too, with the sun's energy beating on it long enough in the primeval soup. Now, you see, in order to have a growth system, you've got to have more than just an open system. You have to have, in addition, you have to have a directing code to direct the growth. You can't just let the thing grow heterogeneously. It has to be directed. And furthermore, there has to be some kind of a mechanism or a motor to convert the sun's energy into the energy of the growth of the structure. An obvious example, of course, would be the case of a seed which grows up into a tree. Here it looks like you're going against this second law of decay and so on. A seed grows up into a tree with lots of seeds. But the fact is, the seed won't grow up into a tree unless you have built into the seed the marvelous information system called the genetic code in the DNA molecule, a marvelous complex system, more complex than even this protein molecule we were talking about. And if it weren't there, if we don't have that genetic code there, it's not going to make a tree no matter how much energy bathes it. And then furthermore, you also have to have a mechanism, and that mechanism in the case of the plant is photosynthesis, which is a marvelous complex system that nobody understands even yet. But if you don't have photosynthesis, the sun's energy is never going to go into the growth of the plant. Now you have to have a code and a mechanism or you don't get this growth. Now the question is, in the case of evolution, what is the code and what is the mechanism? And there's no answer. The evolutionist says mutation and natural selection, and we don't have time to discuss these adequately, but mutation is not a code, it's a random process, and natural selection is not an energy conversion mechanism, it's simply a sort of a sieve that screens out the mutations. And natural selection is not a code either. Mutation isn't an energy conversion process that converts any energy into growth, and you don't have either one of them. And to have growth, you have to have both a code and a mechanism. You don't have that in the case of evolution. Until the evolutionists can not only speculate but demonstrate a code directing the whole evolutionary growth of the biosphere over geologic time, and a mechanism to convert the sun's energy into the growth of the complexity of the organism from particles up to people, he has no right to say that it's scientific, because the scientific law says things go the other way. Things go downhill towards disorganization. Now, in order to, you see, you have to have both a code and a mechanism to have any growth. And you don't have either in the case of evolution. Neither is either. I guess in England I should say neither is either. And if neither is either, they can't both be both. And if you don't have both, you don't get growth. You simply... And until there's an evidence that we do have these, in the case of evolution, evolution is simply precluded by the second law of thermodynamics. It can't happen on any significant scale at all. Now I've got to close, and we haven't really faced the question of the time for this to happen. You see, I have a time problem of my own right now. Everybody just knows that the earth is billions of years old, but the question is, how do we really know that? And the answer is, nobody really knows that. You see, all the history we have goes back about 4,000 or 5,000 years. That's all the history we have in terms of written records. And anything beyond that has to be just guessed at, really, by using some kind of a physical process, such as radiocarbon decay or uranium decay or rate of sedimentation or something else, some physical process upon which we make assumptions. And then on the basis of those assumptions, we can make certain calculations and get an age, but we don't have any way of testing those assumptions to see whether they're valid assumptions, because nobody was there to see what they are. Basically, the assumption is uniformitarianism, that the processes we're talking about have always been the same, operating the same way, same rates. And furthermore, the system we're talking about has always been a closed system so that nothing could get out or get in to upset the balance. But these assumptions are not valid assumptions. They can't be. There's no such thing in nature as a closed system, as was just pointed out. And there's no such thing in nature as a rate which can't be changed if the factors change that control the rate. And this is not just an academic question. We're told that uranium decay, for example, is a foolproof system. It's bound to give the correct answer. But the fact is it doesn't give the correct answer in many, many cases. There are literally scores of instances known. If we had time, we could give you the documentation, where rocks whose age was known to be a recent age within the past few hundred years, because they were formed by a volcanic flow in recent times, rocks dated by uranium dating give billions of years in age when they're known to be hundreds of years in age. Many cases like that. And the same thing with the potassium argon method. Do you know you can take a block of rock with several potassium minerals in it and make the potassium argon dating calculation on each one of them? You get vastly different ages for each one. How can it be a reliable method when that can happen? Take radiocarbon. Radiocarbon is an unstable isotope of natural carbon, and it decays at a rate of about 5,730 years or so for each half-life. And the idea is that in a living system which dies, then it doesn't take in any fresh radiocarbon, and what it has decays, and you can tell how long it's been since it died by making those measurements. But there are a number of assumptions on that, and one of those is that the ratio of radiocarbon to natural carbon in the environment is always the same in time and space. But the fact is that the actual measurements that were made by Dr. Libby and others that have been made since that are more accurate even, and Dr. Libby pointed this out when he first developed the method, the actual measurements indicate that this constant proportion doesn't exist, that more radiocarbon is being formed than is decaying on a worldwide basis, and therefore the amount in the environment is building up. And the assumption of equilibrium isn't valid. And if you rework the equation, instead of having a simple equilibrium equation to make your radiocarbon dating measurements and calculations on, if you use a non-equilibrium equation, it's a little more complex differential equation. But it's not too bad. You can do this. It's been done. And it'll fit the facts much more accurately because it will fit the facts of the actual measurement of the buildup in the environment of radiocarbon. And then you can also use it as a means of measuring the time when the process began. And that means when the atmosphere began, because radiocarbon is formed up in the upper atmosphere. And if you do that, then you have a tremendously good method for measuring the age of the Earth, or the atmosphere at least. And when you do, you know what you get? You get that by the non-equilibrium equation for radiocarbon dating, based on the best measurements that we have, that the age of the atmosphere, which means the age of the Earth, is about 7,000 years. 7,000 years. And all other radiocarbon measurements need to be recalculated and recalibrated in terms of this non-equilibrium model, which fits the facts better than the equilibrium model does. Now, this is thoroughly documented. If anyone questions it, I could give you the documentation, but we don't have the time. Let me close with just one other example. Dr. Barnes is the new president of the Creation Research Society in the States. He's professor of physics at the University of Texas in El Paso, and an authority in the field of magnetism, terrestrial magnetism. He's done a great deal of government research. He's written a widely used textbook in this field. And in the course of one of his research projects, he was making studies on the Earth's magnetism, and he found an interesting thing. He found that the strength of the Earth's magnetic field had been measured right accurately for about 135 years. In other words, we have a longer period of measurements on this particular physical process than any other. And furthermore, it's a worldwide process, not a local process such as a uranium mineral in a granite rock or something. It's a worldwide process and based on a long period of measurements. And he found that on the basis of these measurements, the strength of the Earth's magnetic field is decaying at the rate of half of it every 1,400 years. That means, you see, that 1,400 years ago, the Earth's magnetic field was twice as strong as it is now. And 2,800 years ago, it was 4 times as strong. And 4,200 years ago, it was 8 times as strong, and so on. That's about back to the time of the flood of the Bible. And it just couldn't be much stronger than that. You can calculate that if the magnetic field is caused by circulating currents in the core of the Earth, and that's probably what it's caused by, there's no other better explanation. A circulating current generates a magnetic field and so on. If it was caused by that, currents flow against resistance. You can calculate roughly the amount of heat generated by these flowing currents. And the further back you go with the stronger field and the stronger current, the greater the heating effect. And it turns out if the magnetic field has been on the Earth decaying at this present rate for as much as 10,000 years, the distinction between the Earth's crust and its mantle would have been obliterated by the heat. And if you go back as much as 500,000 years, 500,000 years, back to about the so-called Ice Age, then the heat would have been so great that it would vaporize the Earth. In other words, on the basis of this process, which is based on the best measurements that we have for any process, the Earth can only be a few thousand years in age. I know that this assumes the uniformitarian assumption, but so does the uranium method and all the others. You have to make this assumption anyway. And if you're going to make the uniformitarian assumption, it's more reasonable that it's going to be valid for a short period of time than for a long period of time. And therefore, processes which give a young age are more likely to be correct than those that give an old age. And besides, there are more of them. I have a card here with 25 different processes on it, all of which indicate that the Earth is quite young, with the same kinds of assumptions as uranium dating and so on, indicate that the Earth is young. And there are more of them, and they're based on better methods and so on. But we think that there's no evidence that evolution has had enough time to work, even if it could work. Now, I know that this raises all kinds of questions. I just hope that you'll be interested enough to read some of the literature and get some answers for yourself on this, instead of just continually accepting the indoctrination which we receive in the media and in the schools on evolution. Now, but the evolutionist says, oh, but now wait, you're getting into religion now, you're going to talk about creation. Now, have you noticed that all this evening I haven't referred to the Scripture, haven't quoted a Bible verse, haven't referred to Genesis, haven't referred to any religious doctrine at all. We've been just dealing with the scientific evidence only, and on the basis of that, we found that the scientific evidence supports creation in every case. The literal predictions of the creation model always fit the facts that we predict from it directly. We believe it's a good scientific model, and therefore it ought to at least be presented on an equal basis with evolution in the schools and in the media, on a scientific basis. Now, it's true that that's what's taught in the Bible, and it's also true that if we want to know why these things are so, we can't get that from science. We have to get that from revelation. If you want to know, for example, why nothing is now being created, the answer is because God rested from all of His work which He created and made, as the Scripture says. If you want to know why nothing is passing out of existence, it's because God is upholding all things by the word of His power through Jesus Christ. And if you want to know why everything is going downhill in accordance with the second law, science can't tell you why. It can tell you the fact that that's happening. Can't tell you why. The answer to why is because God said, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake." It says in the book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 21, that the creation has been subjected unto the bondage of decay. And the whole creation is groaning and travailing in pain together until now, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God when Christ comes back again. And so on. If you want to know the why questions, the why answers, if you want to know why the great beds of fossils around the world, great graveyards of dinosaurs and so on, if you want to know why, the answer is, as Peter says, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. That's why. And if you want to know the real significance of this conflict and this problem in the latter days, the answer is given in terms of the text that we read earlier. In the last days, it says men are going to be scoffing, saying, "Where is the promise of His coming?" They'll say, "Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation." That's the doctrine of uniformity and evolution. No real creation, no real beginning, all things continuing as they were from the very beginning of the creation, not just the end of it. Even creation itself is still going on, the same processes. And so therefore, where is the promise of His coming? There was no beginning, there's going to be no end, so we don't need to worry about a future supernatural consummation or termination, because there was no beginning. All things continue as they were. So where's the promise of His coming? But then Peter says, you remember, he doesn't say to compromise with this and to find some means of reconciling it with some new interpretation of Genesis or something. What he says is to recognize this, that this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, that special creation by the word of God, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. That's the great flood. The historical fact of a real creation, a period of construction by special processes, and a worldwide flood of destruction by special processes. This provides the framework within which to answer all of these so-called evidences for the evolutionary model that all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Then he goes on to say, the heavens and the earth which are now by the same word are kept in store, being reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. That's the principle of conservation. This present world is going to be destroyed by fire just as the first one was by water. And then he's going to create a new heavens and a new earth which will last forever. But then he says, "Beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. One day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day." And no, he isn't saying there that the days of creation were thousands of years. That isn't what he says. You have to interpret in context, you know. A text without a context is a pretext. And in the context, he's talking about the conflict between uniformitarianism and catastrophism in the latter days, creationism and evolutionism. And he says men would say that since all things continue as they were, therefore, if you're going to explain the creation, the world in terms of present processes, you have to have an immensity of time. But God isn't limited to present processes. God is omnipotent, and God can do in one day what you would think would take 1,000 years. One day is with the Lord is 1,000 years. God doesn't have to have millions of years to do his work. And 1,000 years is one day. He's not going to necessarily wait a long time to come back again either. But he says the reason he hasn't come and the reason his promise seems to be delayed, the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And you know the word repent, among other things, means simply change your mind. And he wants men to turn their minds away from this naturalistic, evolutionary, uniformitarian world system in which we live, and have their minds transformed by the renewing of their minds, renewed after the image of him who created them, into a mind centered in Jesus Christ as creator and savior and consummator of this world. And he wants men to come to repentance, to change their minds. And that's why his long-suffering and his promise hasn't been fulfilled yet. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, and his promise will be fulfilled. Well, you've been very patient. Thank you, and the Lord bless you.